Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome to the Airbus Beginners Tutorial Series. The aim of this series is to help get you in the air in the default Airbus A320 within Microsoft Flight Simulator and give you the required knowledge to simulate a flight from A to B within the sim. As the name would suggest, this series is very much aimed at people who are new to the Airbus, so we're not looking to learn every single system and procedure in minute detail. That being said, we will still try and follow real-world Airbus procedures as closely as possible. If you are looking for something a little bit more in-depth and a little bit more realistic, then please check out my other tutorial series on the channel, my Airbus Procedures tutorial series. Anyway, now let's head to the flight deck of the A320 and begin the lesson. So once again, welcome back to the flight deck. We're currently cruising over central France, and it's about time now to start setting up for the arrival. So the first thing we need to do is enter the arrival runway and approach into Nice. So to do that we come to flight plan. As you can see, I've already selected 04 left, but we'll run through it again just as a demonstration. So we select Nice, bottom left hand prompt, then we can click on arrival. Scrolling up and down with the arrows we can select the runway and approach type. So we want the ILS 04 left. Obviously you can choose which runway you want depending on the weather and any air traffic clearances. So ILS 04 left. Today we'll be flying the Nissar 6 Romeo arrival. Once again, for anyone that isn't familiar with stars, we can discuss that in another video, but it's basically a published arrival into your destination airport. And then we have the choice of a via, so we'll go via Typic, and then we can insert all of that. We'll come back and check the flight plan in a second. RadNav page, we can check that the ILS frequency is correct, so it gives us a frequency of 109.95, and that is correct for Nice. Performance page, so we can put a selected speed for the descent if we want. That will override the aircraft's managed speed in the descent. It's currently got 240 managed, which is very slow, so I put in 280 as a selected speed. And then for the weather information, we'll have to get the ATIS later on for the weather in Nice, but we can put in the decision altitude for the ILS, and that is 230 feet. That's basically the altitude at which we decide if we're going to land or go around based on the weather conditions in Nice. So that's really all you have to do with the default Airbus to set up for the approach. Next we'll come back up to the navigation display and we'll check the arrival. So we can go plan, and 20 nautical miles is usually a pretty good range. And then just cycling through the flight plan again with the arrows, we can check the arrival routing. So Nissar is the starting waypoint of our arrival today. Just checking each waypoint against the chart. That takes us down to Typic, which was our via waypoint. And then that brings us on to the ILS for 04 left. So that looks pretty reasonable for the arrival. So that's the flight computer all set up. Next we need to set the Autobrake for the arrival. If it's a nice long runway, we pretty much always use Autobrake low. If the runway is a bit shorter, then you might consider Autobrake medium. We pretty much never use Autobrake max for a landing. The Autobrake just ensures that when the aircraft touches down, the aircraft will automatically start to brake for you. You don't need to apply the brake pedals yourself until you want to start manually braking. And that's it really, that's pretty much all you need to do to set up the default A320 for the arrival. Unfortunately, I find that the aircraft guidance currently isn't very good in the default version. Usually we'd use a combination of the managed descent modes based on what's in the MCDU, and we'd back that up with a personal calculation of the descent profile based on the distance to land at the airfield. However, because the landing distance in the flight computer is currently bugged, you can't get an accurate landing distance. So the best way I've found at the moment with the default 320 is just to use the navigation display, using the range rings to get an idea of your distance to the airport. We'll discuss the descent briefly now, and then we'll discuss it in more depth as we carry out the descent. But essentially in the Airbus, a nice rule of thumb, if you times your altitude by 4, that gives you roughly the track miles that you need to descend the aircraft. So for example, right now we're currently at flight level 350. So 35 times 4, that's 140 nautical miles that we need to carry out the descent. So as I said, we'll use the range rings, and once we're just inside the 160 nautical mile range ring to our destination, we'll begin our descent into Nice. So as you can see, we're just coming up on 160 miles now to Nice, so we'll be starting our descent shortly. We'll just discuss the descent briefly before we actually start it, and then we'll discuss it in more depth as we continue down. I find that at the moment the default A320 is pretty broken in terms of flying a managed descent and meeting all the altitude restrictions. And anyway, for the sake of today's video, we're going to disregard any altitude restrictions on the arrival into Nice. We're just going to fly a sort of ideal profile, just to get used to calculating the profile ourselves. So if we did want to fly a managed descent, all we would have to do is set our altitude. So today we'll descend down to 11,000 feet initially, as that's the highest terrain on the way into Nice. And then for a managed descent, as we discussed earlier in the autopilot tutorial, we'll just push the heading selector, and that will force the aircraft down into a managed descent. Once again, it will try and meet any altitude restrictions on the way down. I would suggest though, with the default 320, particularly in its current state, and certainly when you're new to the Airbus, I would use either a selected descent or vertical speed. So selected descent, we just pull the altitude selector and the aircraft will descend as quickly as it possibly can. And we'll use that initially. And then if we start to get low on the profile, we can use vertical speed to reduce our rate of descent. Once again, we'll discuss this in more depth as we continue the descent. If you find that you're high on the profile and you're descending in open descent and you're still not getting back on profile, we basically have two options available to us. We can either increase the speed, which will allow the aircraft to increase its rate of descent, or we can start using the speed brake, which will increase the drag on the aircraft and allow us to descend more quickly. Again, we'll look at those two options if it's relevant during the descent phase of this tutorial. So that's about 140 nautical miles now to Nice. We can start our descent. Once again, we're basing that on 4 times our altitude. Will give us our track miles that we need to descend, so 4 times 35 is 140. We've already set 11,000 feet. We should see 11,000 blue down here. We don't currently, but again, just a bug with the aircraft. So we'll pull the altitude selector now, and that should put us into an open descent. And there you can see descent and flight level 110 blue. So the aircraft's thrust will now come back to idle, and then the aircraft will start descending, keeping us at a managed speed of 285 knots. And then periodically through the descent, we'll basically just keep recalculating the track miles that we need to descend based on our current altitude, and then we'll intervene as required to manage our profile. So for example, when we reach flight level 320, we should need 128 track miles for the descent. So there's flight level 320, and you can see we're starting to approach the 120 nautical mile range ring now on the navigation display. So we're probably about 130 miles, so we're still roughly on profile. Once again, in the real world, we'd be checking the distance off the flight plan, but unfortunately we can't do that because the flight plan is bugged in the default aircraft. So coming up on 25,000 feet now, that means we need 100 miles to run, and we're still nearly 120, so we are actually getting a little bit low on profile now. Where possible, we don't want to get too low in the real world, it's quite inefficient, so a good idea right now would be go to selected speed and just reduce the vertical speed. As you can see, we now have vertical speed as the descent mode. The aircraft will match that vertical speed, and then the thrust will come up to maintain our managed speed. We'll go 1500 feet a minute for now. That will allow us to slowly regain the profile that we want for the descent. So passing through 20,000 feet, we'd usually turn the seatbelt signs on, however they are inoperative in the default 320. And 20,000 feet, that means we now need 80 miles for the descent. As you can see, we're still around 100 miles, so we're still low on profile at the moment. We'll leave the vertical speed at 1500 feet. Another good tip for everybody, essentially what we're trying to fly here is a 3-degree profile, more or less. And if you want to know what vertical speed you require for a 3-degree profile, you can just times your ground speed by 5. So for example, right now we're doing nearly 400 knots, so we need roughly 2,000 feet a minute to maintain a 3-degree profile. So if we were on profile and we were doing more than 2,000 feet a minute, we would know we're diverging away from the profile low. And if we were doing less than 2,000 feet a minute, we would know that we're diverging away from the profile and trending high. And we're once again pretty much back on profile now. As I said, for today's video I want to keep the descent very conservative, so we will plan to level off before approaching the ILS. So we can come back now, once again timesing our ground speed by 5. That gives us a descent rate of around 1700 feet. So we'll go VS minus 1700, and that should give us a nice descent back down towards 11,000 feet. So we'll level off here for the moment. That's out star and out cruise, should just say out. So we're now at 11,000 feet, which means we need 44 miles to run, and we've got over 50, I would say, there. So we'll pause the video here. We'll come back in the next part of the series to carry out the approach and the landing. So I do hope you enjoyed the video, guys, and found it informative. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. That really helps the channel to grow, and I really appreciate the support. If you have any comments or questions for me, please leave them down in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. But for now, thanks very much, and I'll see you all again soon.